This is Jennifer Gonzalez welcoming you to episode 264 of the Cult of Pedagogy podcast. In this episode, we'll explore ways we can support neurodivergent teachers. I want to start this episode with a little disclaimer. I've put the episode together to help other teachers, but I'm also kind of making it about me. Earlier this year, I made a discovery about myself that couldn't have been more of a shock. I was talking with my best friend Angela, like I have done almost every day for the last 10 years, and for some reason I can't remember now, she was looking at signs of ADHD in adult women who are often undiagnosed. Without much hesitation, she said, "Jen, I think you have ADHD." My first thought was, no way. I've known a ton of people with ADHD, and I don't think I'm anything like them. I don't think I'm any more disorganized than your average person. I almost always meet deadlines. I don't think anyone has ever described me as scattered, and I'm definitely not what you would call hyperactive. But then she started making a case for it. Through our regular conversations, Angela had heard me say on an almost daily basis that I was behind on things, on everything, all the time. I got sick of hearing myself say it. She had watched me start projects that took years to complete and ultimately abandon many more after years of saying I was going to get to them soon. When we talked about our working styles, I'd always marveled at the way she was able to start a task, work on it for a few hours, take a reasonable break, and then finish it more or less on time. Meanwhile, I would have to set Pomodoro timers and give myself treats to finish even a percentage of a task. As I did more reading on my own, I started to see that I had been busting my butt for years to compensate for my natural ADHD tendencies, coming up with all kinds of tricks and strategies and workarounds. And when those didn't work, wearing myself out trying, or beating myself up for not being able to do what everyone else could do. Like the way I get super stressed out when I'm trying to focus on a task and someone interrupts me, especially one of my kids when they were younger. I realize now it was because I had such a fragile hold on my own attention that the slightest thing could disrupt my whole flow, and I knew I wouldn't be able to get it back again. I thought about the way I have to set timers for anything important happening in my day, because if I'm planning to do any concentrating whatsoever, that other thing will drop out of my brain immediately and I'll forget it. So if I have anything at all planned in the coming 6 to 8 hours, I walk around with extra anxiety because if I don't, I'll definitely forget that thing. Lately, I've even set alarms to go off while I'm driving to remind me to run an errand I had planned to do for fear that I would space out and forget it. And then I started thinking about what I was like as a teacher. I absolutely got things done, like grading papers and planning lessons, but it took me hours and hours and completely wore me out. I thought about how hard it was to stick to rules like making my students raise their hands before they spoke, because anytime a student would pop up with a question, I would just answer it, forgetting that I was trying to stick to a system. And then there was the noise, the way it would build up and I'd shout back at it when it finally got too much to bear. My students' faces always registering shock because they had no idea it was even bothering me until it did. I didn't think there was a name for any of this. I thought it was just how I was. Once I was able to name it, so many things made so much more sense. I haven't done anything medical to address my ADHD. I'm still really in the process of accepting the label for myself, and I've already put so many systems in place to keep me functioning. But now I can find even more strategies to help. And I beat myself up about it a lot less, and that is really nice. Anyway, on episode 255, Tom Rademacher and I happened to get talking just a little bit about our ADHD, and my guest today heard it. You might remember Emily Kircher-Morris from episode 243 when she and Amanda Morin shared some ways that we can make classrooms more neurodiversity affirming. When Emily heard my conversation with Tom, she reached out and said, hey, could we do an episode about neurodiverse teachers and how they can manage some of the unique ways the job of teaching affects them? It was an easy yes. Emily has written a fantastic post for Cult of Pedagogy about some of the strengths that neurodivergent teachers bring to their work, the challenges that they face in the job, and how schools can best support them. In today's episode, we'll talk about it all. Before we get started, I'd like to thank Foundry 10 for sponsoring this episode. Teens want to learn more social media literacy in school, but too often what they get sounds like an outdated PSA. Don't share personal info. Avoid strangers. So how can educators make the lessons more relevant? Foundry 10 is an education research organization that blends research and practice to make a real difference for real youth today, while deepening understanding about effective teaching strategies. Through applied research, they are studying everything from social media literacy instruction to soft skills in career-connected learning to supporting number knowledge with dramatic play. They generate insights from impactful practices, expand ideas about learning, and create immediate value for youth, educators, schools, and community-based organizations. If you're looking for fresh research-backed ideas you can apply in your classroom, visit www.foundry10.org/cultofpedagogy. That's foundry10.org/cultofpedagogy. Support also comes from School AI. There's a lot of buzz about AI in education right now. Lots of tools promise to save you time. And that matters. Teachers need support. School AI believes that the best AI tools shouldn't only make teachers' jobs easier. They should improve student learning. With School AI, every student gets personalized support that adapts to their level, whether they're struggling with the basics or ready for something harder. You get real-time insights that show you who needs you most and where students are making progress. As you can see, School AI is focused on student outcomes. They're building safe, thoughtful AI that helps every learner thrive. Visit schoolai.com and create your free account. Now here's my conversation with Emily Kircher-Morris about how we can support neurodivergent teachers and how they can support themselves. Emily, welcome back to the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
You came to me with this idea, and I was so excited because I am a very recently self-diagnosed woman with ADHD, and it could not have been more of a shock to me. Angela Watson is my best friend. She's another education podcaster, and she knows pretty much everything about me. And we sort of stumbled on this, and she started doing some reading, and she said, Jen, I think you have ADHD. And I was like, what? And as she started to point things out, I realized, oh my gosh, this is the reason for so many of the issues that I've had. So you heard me mention this on a recent podcast with Tom Rodmacher and said, hey, let's talk about this, how it impacts teachers.
Yeah.
So yeah, before we do that, let's just remind everybody of sort of what you do and who you are, because you've been on the podcast just recently.
Yeah. So I'm the host of the Neurodiversity podcast, but primarily I'm a licensed professional counselor, but I came to the mental health field from the education world. So I started my career as a elementary education teacher. And then I taught both in gifted ed classrooms, both at the elementary, middle school level. And then also I was a school counselor before I made this transition. So, but the other thing that's a little bit interesting is part of the reason that resonated for me when you were sharing that is that I'm also an ADHDer. However, I am somebody who was diagnosed in the early 90s. And so, which is pretty rare. There were not a lot of people in general being diagnosed, but especially girls back then. And so, and even though I knew that as a child, it hasn't really been until the last, I would say, 10 years or so where I've really started to understand a lot more about how that impacted me, even as a young teacher in the classroom, and how that really influenced my professional trajectory. And I think it's something that we don't even really think about too much as far as how we support teachers and just recognizing that there are probably so many people out there who are not diagnosed.
Yeah. And the thing that's interesting is that once you have a diagnosis, even if it isn't like official, you start to develop a whole language and an explanation for for me personally why I struggled so much with certain things as a definitely as a teacher, as a parent of young children too.
Mm-hmm.
And just seeing, and what you've done is you've written a really, really good post for the site that kind of outlines, and we're going to talk about, what strengths, neurodivergent teachers have and what, struggles they have, and then how they can support themselves and how their schools can support them. And if I had this, teaching could have been a completely different experience for
Mm-hmm.
me.
Mm-hmm.
So we've talked a little bit already about kind of like why we're
Mm-hmm.
seeing this, you call it in the article, the lost generation of neurodivergent educators. And it's got to do with this idea that like people just weren't being diagnosed when a lot of us who are now in our 30s, 40s, 50s, and so on didn't have language for it back then.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I mean, it's not just ADHD, right? I mean, there's a lot
Mm,
of those different labels that kind of fall into this. But recognizing that, we talk a lot about ADHD. We talk a lot about autism. There are other labels that fall under this
mm,
neurodivergent umbrella, of
mhm.
course. But when I think about this, when there are so many people like my students, when I first started teaching, I taught third grade, and those kids at this point in time are probably like in their 30s.
Yep.
And that was at a time like Asperger's was added to the DSM in 1994, but it wasn't even until like the early to mid 2000s that I, as a pretty new teacher, but even teachers who'd been established had even really heard of that. And
Mhm.
so part of this process of adults getting diagnosed, many adults are coming to a diagnosis now
Mhm.
because their children get diagnosed. So their kids get diagnosed with ADHD, and or with autism or whatever it might be. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, wait a second, this actually makes some things kind of fall into place for me. And so, but because of some of the barriers. So like, for example, even now, if you take your child to a pediatrician and you're like, hey, I think my kid has ADHD, whatever, one of the first questions out of the pediatrician's mouth is going to be, well, how are their grades?
Yeah.
And what we know is that that is not a great a great measure of whether or not somebody is struggling with executive functioning. Like that
Yeah.
just is not realistic to look at it in just that very narrow viewpoint. And so, especially for girls, and that's kind of the piece
Mm.
that we get into, because with most labels, whether it's autism, ADHD, even dyslexia and learning disabilities,
Mm.
the rate of boys who get diagnosed earlier is much higher than girls, because what do girls tend to do? Girls tend to internalize a lot of
Mhm.
behaviors. Boys
Mhm.
tend to externalize. So who do we see? Well, we see the boys who are bouncing off the walls. We see the boys who are really impulsive and doing all these things. I think part of the reason I got diagnosed when I was a kid is that I do externalize a lot. I think I have a lot of those quote unquote behaviors that made it
Yeah.
really obvious that something's going on. Um, but it's just hard as an adult to kind of like recontextualize everything that you thought you knew about yourself
Yeah.
with this new label. And what does that really mean?
And that's been the thing that I've been wrapping my head around in the last couple of months as I've embraced this and said maybe this is possible. My first reaction was no, because I thought of these very, very jumpy, fidgety boys. And I
Mm-hmm.
was just like, that's not me. I don't have a problem with that. And the other thing that I'm starting to realize is that I'm talking to more adults that I know who have called themselves ADHD. And I'm like, you're totally like crushing it in all of life. Like, and they're like, yeah, because I manage it. And now I'm realizing I have been able to compensate for it in a lot of ways. Some of it has been just sort of naturally kind of figuring out the same kinds of strategies that are given to kids when
Mm-hmm.
they get, I write notes to myself everywhere. I
Right.
use timers and everything. But what I've also done meanwhile is constantly beat myself up for needing all of that stuff
Mm-hmm.
and
Like
like
I
label
should be able
myself
to do
with
this.
like, yeah, with like, I'm
Mm-hmm.
forgetful or I'm scatterbrained. And so now it's allowing me to give myself so much more grace and just say, no, your brain just works differently from other people.
Mm-hmm.
And it's nicer because it was just always like, God, what's wrong with me?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I think I I started my teaching career, like I said, I taught elementary education, and I have to tell you that it was so hard.
Mm,
I left the general. As a matter of fact, I left. I taught for a little bit, and then I actually left the classroom, and I was like, I'm not teaching anymore. And I
yeah.
spent a year, and I was like, kind of doing a couple of other jobs, and I was like long-term subbing and this sort of stuff. And then I was like,
Mm.
okay, this is silly. I have this degree in these student loans. Like, I need to do something with it. So I started going back, and I got a master's in gifted ed, which is kind of how I started on that path, which was a
Mm,
much better fit for me. Um, but what I realized, though, looking back, is the thing that was hardest for me about teaching in the elementary school classroom was the amount of executive functioning that it required.
yes.
And so even though I had an ADHD diagnosis as a kid and I went through, by the time I was in high school, I stopped taking my meds. My mom was like, whatever, figure it out, you know? And so then I spent over 15 years treating myself for anxiety and depression until my
Wow.
own son was diagnosed with ADHD. He's a senior this year. He was in second grade then. And I
Hmm.
saw what a difference the medication made for him. And so I went back to my doctor and said, hey, what do you think? And it was like, all of a sudden, that was like when I really came to terms with what that diagnosis meant for me, and the fact that, no, I'm actually not all that anxious, but I am anxious when
Yeah.
I can't manage all the executive functioning
Yes.
stuff. That's what triggers the anxiety. And if I can slow my brain down, if I can manage the executive functioning, then I feel okay about those things.
Yes.
But again, because my grades were okay,
Right.
and so and even as a teacher, as a professional, you know, I don't know. I think a lot of teachers are this way, where you just you're an achiever, like you have a kind of a vision and high standards for yourself,
Hmm.
and I don't think you get into teaching without having some of that in some ways. And
Yes.
so then you don't realize, it's like, why is this so hard for me? Why do
Hmm.
I feel like a failure at the end of the day?
Yes.
And I don't know, I'd love to hear a little bit more about what it was like, though, for you.
Oh, you know, when we start to some of the things that you wrote in this post, I saw them and I was just like, oh, first of all, I'm also an Enneagram 3. And I don't know if
Mm.
you know Enneagram, but Enneagram 3 is the achiever. And so every day
Mm.
you start with a blank slate, having to sort of earn your place in the world. So that combined with this, and then being a teacher where your work is never done and you
Mhm.
sort of fail every single day because it's such an imperfect science that you're trying to conduct. So it was, I just, I mean, I have lifelong insomnia now, which
Mm.
I haven't even been in the classroom in 20 years, but I still have that brain of just like, there's more to do. I'm behind, I'm behind, I'm behind, I'm
Mhm.
behind.
Always.
The thing that I also really struggled with, and this is where you got into a little bit of like the autism stuff,
Mhm.
was the sensory stuff. I have big
Mhm.
struggles with like, just block out the noise. And I was just like, nope. And I can remember when my kids would start to get noisy, I would like just yell back at them just
Mhm.
to push the noise back. And it would always
Mhm.
shock them because they didn't realize I was having a buildup inside. They thought we were
Mhm.
having a good old time. And then all of a sudden I was like, ah, and it was me just trying to get the noise out of the way and let me
Mhm.
think for a second.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Well, that auditory processing is huge for, I think we talk a lot about sensory hypo or hypersensitivity to sensory stimuli with autism, because it is actually part of the diagnostic criteria. You don't have to have that to qualify for an autism diagnosis, but it is one of four criteria where you have to have two. But
yeah,
there is a sensory component to ADHD for sure, because when you think about it, when you think about what is distracting or what is causing the difficulty with regulating focus and attention, it is that my brain is being pulled in all these different directions. So before we started recording, I was like, do you hear those voices out in the hallway? Like, I can't tune those things out in my
yes,
head.
yes,
And it's really like, I know that about myself, and it's like I get very frustrated when I can't direct my focus at what I want to
right.
focus on. And you end up getting, it causes emotional dysregulation. It causes overwhelm. And then and this is the thing about so many traits of neurodivergence. So many of the difficulties that come along with it are viewed as character flaws, as moral failings.
That's what I
And
did to
that's what we
myself.
internalize. Hmm.
Yes,
Yeah.
I've spent my whole life trying to make myself more chill. Because no matter whether it was a parenting situation or a teaching situation, I would look at everybody else around me and think, why isn't this thing bothering them? Why isn't that little noise? Why isn't that blinking light bothering them? Why? And I was just like, it's because I'm too type A. I'm too anal retentive. I'm too focused on stupid little details. Why can't I just be chill?
Yeah.
And now I realize and the thing that was such an epiphany for me is when I started reading the strengths piece, which we're going to get into. Like, it's not just that you have challenges, you also bring some strengths. That also explained some stuff to me.
Yeah.
And it made me feel better, because it was just like the fact that I see problems and notice things and can come up with solutions. And I'm always the only one in the room saying, what about this? And everyone's like, oh, I didn't even think about that.
Right.
And so it's a blessing and a curse.
Yeah, that goes along with it.
Yeah.
Well, and so many of these things are also a double-edged sword. So like you mentioned that in the Enneagram, you're kind of that achiever mentality. Sometimes that is a compensatory strategy that neurodivergent people develop. Like, oh, I have messed up on all of these things. So now it's almost like a hypervigilance. Like I have to pay attention to all of the details in order to compensate for that, because I get, again, anxious about making those mistakes. Yeah. And so, it's interesting to kind of think about, these are things that really, in many ways, are assets, but also have struggles that come along with it. And I just also want to be on record saying, like, I am not somebody who believes that, like, this is my personal opinion. Obviously, many things are my personal opinion that we're talking about, but also, like, I don't think that it is helpful for us to view neurodivergence as like a superpower, because I think that minimizes the struggles that come along with it. Yep. And I just want to be very clear that it is definitely both and. There are strengths and there are also struggles. Right. It's not better than or less than, it's just different, and trying to find those ways that we can support people who have this different type of wiring so that they can be successful, when they are the people who are teaching our kids.
Yes. Yes. It's learning just how to manage it. And I also, having learned more about it for myself, I can remember certain students and things that they would do. And now I'm realizing, that she didn't have a label, but she was, one example I'm thinking of right now, and I do this all the time still. I do this when I go to CrossFit and the coach is giving us our instructions, and I'm thinking in my head, I have a question. And I put my hand up and she's like, I was going to get to that. And I'm like, I know, but I was afraid I was going to forget it. Yeah. And I do. And I remember kids being like, they would be blurters and we would treat it as a discipline problem. And now I'm realizing they knew that it was going to run out of their head. And if we had had a strategy of just like, here, just write it down and then you'll have it. So the number of times that I like lash out at people because I'm just like, don't say anything right now because this thought is about to leave my head.
Yeah.
You're going to make it
play. Yeah. And that's a huge, that's so important though, because I think what you're really getting at there is the fact that, like, so when we were on the podcast in the past, my co-author Amanda and I were on the podcast and we talked about our book, Neurodiversity Affirming Schools, which really is about one of the main theses of that book is that we have to move away from treating things that are traits of neurodivergence as discipline issues.
Yes.
And part of my experience growing up, part of the reason I went into education was because as an ADHDer, I had a diagnosis, I had a label, but that was about as far as the supports went back in the 90s. And it was like basically, so I just had consequences, I had discipline, I had behavior charts, but nobody was teaching me the strategies or the skills. It was like, here's your consequence, now figure it out. Yeah. And I'm like, but when you're talking about that, it's like, okay, so the kid who blurts the thing out, okay, here's a Post-it note. Yeah. Jot it down. This is a strategy. This is a skill. I'm going to scaffold this for you. I'm going to help support you with this until you can do it independently. But then that is a skill that you will take forward with you into adulthood. But again, this is the thing about the neurodivergent adults who never got these diagnoses is that either you figured it out on your own or you didn't.
Right.
And that had a huge consequence with where you ended up in life. Mm-hmm.
As a person who was teaching mostly in the 90s and had a lot of those 504 plans come, it would just be like ADHD. And I was just like, okay. But it was literally just like, that's all it was. It was an explanation for why this kid moved around a lot. I mean, you really didn't have, we didn't have any strategies as teachers to apply to them. So we were all kind of lost.
Trying to just figure it out. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
All right, let's start. You started by talking about the strengths that
Mhm.
neurodivergent educators bring. And this part was a new piece for me to
Mhm.
read. So, can we like go through some of those? If somebody's hearing us and saying, this kind of sounds like it might be me,
Mhm.
or I already know it's me, let's hear what some of the pluses are to start with.
Sure. Well, the one that you mentioned earlier was like the pattern recognition, right? And the
Mm-hmm.
problem solving. So one of the reasons that sometimes ADHDers specifically are really good at this is because there's a lot of evidence that shows that ADHD brains have a lot of that divergent thinking, like lateral thinking, because of almost like because of the distractibility, you make these leaps
Mm-hmm.
and are kind of intuitive with things, but then you notice when something doesn't match up with that, right? Like you're like, okay, well,
Mm-hmm.
wait a second, if this, then this, but then this part doesn't fit with that.
Mm-hmm.
There are also just being able to look at things kind of from that other angle, because again, if you've been somebody who's been compensating for years with
Mm-hmm.
a brain that kind of shows up differently, you do solve problems differently, you do approach things differently. And so having that ability to look at things and notice those inconsistencies is something that we all need on teams, in whether we're looking at how we support students and try to figure out a plan for helping them, whatever growth area that they have, or just developing systems in place, to have in the schools. Like we need those
Yeah.
people who can notice those discrepancies and offer different options.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. And this, I mean, I kind of always felt like I was nitpicky. And that's,
Mm,
a lot of times I would notice something and I would not bring it up because I thought I'm always the one who's just like, this little nuanced thing is kind of a problem. Like, what if we try? And everybody else is just kind of like, you're so extra. Like, why do you have to, And so I would have to sort of choose my battles as
yeah.
opposed to constantly mentioning little details that I noticed because everybody else was more chill. And so,
Yeah.
you
I
know,
wonder also how much of that for you was the fact that, um, if things historically for you in your lifetime, if you felt like there were a lot of gaps, a lot of things that weren't always adding up, so then you have this drive to make sure that you're not missing things. So like, hey, wait a second, I see
mm,
this thing that doesn't fit. I need to
mhm.
make sure that it fits, because otherwise I might be missing
Yeah.
the whole
Yes.
point of whatever. And again, that almost becomes that, just that compensatory strategy, right? To
Yeah.
to to
Yeah.
do that. And
There's a
so,
very unsettled feeling when
mhm.
something is off I will just keep at it until I can figure out what it is. And then once I notice what it is, I can't sort of shut up about
Yeah,
it. So
yeah, yeah, it needs to all add in. Well, and
yeah.
it's also interesting to think about some of the other kind of pieces. So another strength that I notice a lot, just with neurodivergent people in general, but how it applies in the schools, is a lot of ADHDers often really love novelty.
Mm,
they thrive on novelty.
mhm.
Part of the reason why when I got into gifted ed, that was such a better fit for me is the way I always described it. Again, before I really understand what was happening, is it was a lot more front end planning than it was back end planning. And so it was about creating these units of study and coming up, there was a lot more freedom with some of that, as opposed to following a curriculum that was super rigid,
Yeah. Yep.
as well as the fact that I didn't have to go back. It wasn't as much grading. It wasn't as much remediation. Like that
Mm,
task persistence for me was an executive functioning skill that was
yep.
struggle. That was a struggle.
Yes.
But then when I was able to be in the gifted ed classroom, and again, this was just based on how our district's model was,
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
structured, but it really fed into that novelty. Like I loved that. But in general, though, novelty is a great strength, and we need to keep things novel. That's part of how we keep kids engaged. It's part of how we build morale and like all of these different um, areas. When you lean into that, can be really effective in how we support neurodivergent people in the
Yeah.
schools.
Yeah. So we've got pattern recognition and problem
Hmm.
solving, this love of novelty, which
Hmm.
can end up making a very creative teacher who,
Hmm.
has, brings a lot of just like fun, novel experiences
Yeah.
in. What else? What are some other
Yeah,
strengths?
I think a big one that we often talk about is hyperfocus and monotropism. Those are kind of like
Hmm.
two things. So in general, we talk about hyperfocus a lot more when we're talking about ADHD, but that's not the only place we'll see it. But hyperfocus is basically like when I get so involved in something that I can't even like I don't even notice other things that are sometimes going on around me, or I have a really
Mm-hmm.
hard time shifting from whatever that purpose is.
Mm-hmm.
Monotropism, we usually talk about more related to autism. And so monotropism, though, is similar to hyperfocus, but it's a longer term thing. So like I'm super into this particular topic,
Yeah.
and sometimes that can even be lifelong, right? Like it, or it can,
Mm-hmm.
and so but when we have that, again, that ability to focus on those things, that ability to really dive in deep. People talk
Mm-hmm.
about like going down the rabbit hole, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
that's not a bad thing. We need people who can do that in order to think about how to lesson plan, to think about how to approach a problem in a different way. And
Yeah.
so, you know, that really can be an asset as well. And I think the other one that always comes to mind when we talk about strengths um, is just if you're neurodivergent, you have empathy for your neurodivergent students.
Yeah.
And I know that's the case for me. It's part of the reason why I ended up shifting even from being in the classroom to doing the mental health counseling and being a school counselor, was because I recognized so much of that in my own experience and what my kids were facing, and wanting to really, you know, connect with them and help them have better experiences than I feel like a lot of people did.
Mm-hmm. And this is why I think this is going to be such an important episode, because, you know, the first time I think I recognized that the definitions or the diagnostics for ADHD and autism came to me, as so many things have in the last few years, through TikTok, because so many of the people that I was following presented as just regular old people, just
Mm-hmm.
talking the way everybody I sort of, and then they'd be like, and I'm autistic. And I'm like, wait, like,
Mm-hmm.
you don't sound the way that I have been shown people with autism sound. So I was just like, what? And then,
Mm-hmm.
and there was more and more people talking about how they had ADHD. And my first thought was like, oh, this is so trendy now. Apparently
Yeah.
everybody has ADHD. And I still didn't
Yeah.
see myself in it. I still didn't see it.
Yeah. Well, and to be
So yeah.
fair, I do think it's important to recognize, like they've done some studies, and there's a lot of misinformation on TikTok about how diagnostic criteria presents and
Mm-hmm.
different things. So I think that is, proceed with caution, you know,
Yes.
as always
Yeah.
with any of that. But it does give a face to things. I mean, even now, one of the biggest barriers I feel like for so many autistic individuals is that there's so much stigma surrounding those labels and
Mm-hmm.
diagnoses. Unless you are really involved in that neurodiversity community,
Yeah.
I think that beyond that, it's like I talk to families all the time, and we do assessments at our office. I work with families and kids, and parents are very afraid of an
Mm.
autism diagnosis,
Oh, I
more than an
bet.
ADHD diagnosis
Yeah.
specifically. But again, that's because the idea, the stigma of this is that, you know, you either have you either have somebody who looks like Sheldon from Big Bang Theory, or
Right.
you have somebody who is really significantly disabled and primarily non-speaking. And
Yes.
I think that is the image that most people have in their mind, but it can
Right.
look it's so much more broad than that. But people just don't know what that really looks like all the
And
time.
this is why, at least my understanding is why the terminology has now changed to just ASD. Is that
Hmm.
still
Yeah.
the preferred
Yeah.
term?
So Asperger's. So, well, I love getting into some of this historical kind of goofy stuff, but I'll only put it in this perspective. So in 2013, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the fifth edition, was released. That was when the Asperger's diagnosis that had been present previously was rolled into the autism spectrum diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I will tell you that I prefer to use the term autism or autism spectrum. I try to drop that word disorder, just from
Okay.
a neurodiversity
Yeah.
perspective, like affirming perspective. Part of it also is in the UK and in Europe, they don't call it autism spectrum disorder. They call it autism spectrum condition, which I think is really an interesting
Mm.
little difference there in how in
Yeah.
semantics.
Oh,
But
yeah.
when this happened, so then yes, so everything's kind of rolled into this autism label. But then the other thing that's interesting about this is in 2013, that was the first time somebody could have both an ADHD and an autism diagnosis.
Mm.
Prior to that, they were mutually exclusive. So
Okay.
I often say I was diagnosed with ADHD before Asperger's was even in the DSM. It was added to the DSM in 1994.
Huh.
So I've never been assessed for autism or Asperger's. I always notice a lot of those traits about myself. I don't think I meet diagnostic criteria now, but I think
Mm-hmm.
if I were a kid today, if I were 8 years old today, having the same concerns I had then, we would have at least evaluated for it.
Right,
But
right.
but when we talk going back to that lost generation piece, that's part of why it has shifted so much as far as how we see and understand this, because that's not that long ago. I mean, I'm not
Right.
that old
Right. Yeah.
where, and so, but prior to 1994, nobody was getting an Asperger's diagnosis, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let alone people who are not typically presenting, with
Right.
some of those differences.
And what I'm picking up from you and what I've kind of assumed as I'm learning more about this is that this is not a black and white thing anyway. The
Mm-mm.
word spectrum really is important, and the
Yeah.
word traits is important. That, you know, there are certain pieces of the ADHD descriptors that I'm just like, yeah, I don't have an issue with being on time. It
Hmm.
also might be that I've compensated
Yeah.
so hard
Hmm.
that's why.
Yeah.
But, I think anyone listening might be like, well, that sort of sounds like me, but not, you can have traits, but not
Yes.
necessarily be like
And
all the way on
and
the,
you can
yeah,
have traits and benefit from some of the strategies and accommodations.
exactly.
And that kind of gets into some of the systemic things about what schools can do to support, like what's good for neurodivergent students is good for all
It's good for
students. What's good for
everybody.
neurodivergent teachers
Yes.
is good for all teachers. And so thinking about it from that perspective is a way to kind of approach that.
Yeah. So before we start getting into the strategies that teachers can
Mhm.
use, let's just talk about why schools, because we've been more generalized about
Mhm.
ADHD and autism. Why is a teaching job particularly challenging for somebody who has a neurodivergent brain?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned specifically the executive function overload. So
Mm-hmm.
all I would say pretty much most diagnoses that you can come up with that are in the DSM, whether it's a
Mm-hmm.
neurodevelopmental diagnosis like autism or ADHD or a learning disability, or
Mm-hmm.
even more of a psychological, like an anxiety or depression, there is an executive functioning impact in all of those areas. Like one of the
Mm-hmm.
things when we do assessments, it's super hard to tell sometimes if something is anxiety or if it's ADHD, because
Yeah.
it manifests in much the same way, where it's like some of that avoidance. Okay, well, is that avoidance anxiety based, or is it difficulty with task initiation, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and so, but executive function overload. There's When you are working in the schools, you have to be doing so many things at so many different times and
Yeah.
holding all of that information in your working memory.
Yes.
There are so many transitions throughout the day that you have to
Uh-huh.
be ready for. And in some ways that can actually be good. Like, so for some, like the transition specifically, for me as an ADHDer, I don't mind the transitions. It helps me feel like I'm moving, like that hyperactive piece of
Mm-hmm. It's
myself.
the
Like,
novelty. It's like
yes,
now
yes.
something
Okay. Now
different,
we're
a
moving
new
on.
dopamine hit. Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
However, at the same time though, if you're not prepared, if you're like, if like you're not set up to have everything ready to go,
Yes.
or again, lots of people just struggle with those transitions overall. Um, that just gets trying to juggle all of those things at once can be really overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
And we talk a little bit about we talk a lot about masking and camouflage in the neurodivergent
Mm.
community.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that people will try to camouflage is executive functioning difficulties, but the
Mm.
amount of energy that takes, the amount of um, just bandwidth as far as what you're putting into something, it is exhausting.
Yeah.
I mean, teaching in general is exhausting,
Right.
let alone
Yeah.
because you have to be on for that whole day with students and then everything else that goes along with it. But yeah, the executive function overload is a huge piece that is a struggle
Mm-hmm.
for a lot of neurodivergent teachers.
Mm-hmm. And for me, when I hear you talk about masking, the piece that resonates the most with me, or what I picture myself doing, is pretending not to be as frazzled as I actually felt,
Mm-hmm.
because I knew that was just embarrassing. Like,
Mm-hmm.
just get it together and don't be so like, I can't manage all this stuff, and just like go to your quiet place whenever you get a chance and start organizing it on paper or
Yeah.
something. Yeah.
Well, and I was everybody camouflages to some extent in different environments, right? Like we
Right.
all have different personas that we kind of put on. I don't
Yeah.
ever want to make it sound like that's bad. However, if you are camouflaging and masking how much the sensory environment is impacting you, right?
Mm,
Like you don't have a lot of control over that in this school
mm,
environment.
mhm.
If you are constantly camouflaging, like with the social communication piece, um, there is a lot of communicating that goes on, especially from peer to peer, like with teacher colleagues. And
Yeah.
I would say that I don't want to, I'm going to make a generalization. I feel like sometimes probably people who teach feel a little more comfortable with their students just because it's a bit of a different type of dynamic with that. Like I
Yep.
know for me, one of the reasons I also went into teaching was I always felt more comfortable with kids who are younger than myself.
Mhm.
Like than with people my own age. Like that was
Yeah.
just an easier relationship as far as
Yeah.
that goes. But when I have to go and work in my PLC, when I have to go and talk to the teacher across the hallway and ask if they'll do my recess duty or whatever it might
Right.
be, like those types of social interactions can be really stressful and overwhelming.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the sensory
Mhm.
overload. That's another like big piece of, and I feel like for me that was the thing I struggled with the absolute most, was
Mhm.
just never being able to get enough quiet
Yeah.
to really focus. And
Well, I
yeah.
really appreciated how you mentioned the part about it then caused the emotional overwhelm. Because I
Yes.
think that's what people don't pick up on, that is that when you are in a sensory environment that is really stressful to you,
Mhm.
you can try to manage it, try to manage it, try to manage it. But what ends up coming to the surface is anxiety and irritability, like that,
Mhm.
because you don't have control over those things. And as teachers, one of our primary jobs that we do not talk about enough in teacher prep programs is that you have to be able to regulate your emotions to
Yes.
be an effective teacher. And
Yes.
that is a huge component of it. But I know the same, I can relate to that so strongly, that same feeling of, it's like, it's interesting. It's like I'm sitting here talking to you right now. You can see me and people are listening, but I'm swinging back and forth in my chair. I don't know if you know this, but I have this little fidget in my hand that I'm playing with. But I know that I need that. But depending on how somebody understands their own neurodivergence,
Mm,
they may not feel comfortable doing those things. They may feel like
right.
I have to present a certain way. I have to stand a certain way. I can't have fidgets in my hands. I also don't want my students to have fidgets in their hands. So then, like those are the types of things where it's like, what are the strategies that work for you?
Yeah.
What are the things that but yeah, schools in general are often not a very sensory friendly environment for anybody who has some of those sensitivities. Like it's just a that's just not, I mean, they're kids. And I'm not saying
Right.
like I'm not saying kids need to always be quiet or that we shouldn't have those
No.
things, but it is, if you're aware of it though, then you can kind of go, "Oh, you know what I need to do during my lunch break? I need to go and I'm going to eat lunch in my classroom as opposed to like down in the staff
Yes.
break room, because I just know that I need that to reset, even though there might be that social pressure to feel like I have to be there, right? And
Yes.
but
But
also you worry, it's like, am I missing something? Am I giving
I
something
know.
up? It's so hard
Yeah.
to balance that.
The emotion, the neurological regulation of
Mhm.
my system that would happen when my kids would go to their elective and the whole hall would get quiet
Mhm.
and I would shut my door and all of a sudden like I could feel my entire nervous system just going,
Yeah.
okay.
Well, and isn't it interesting too, because the things we don't think about, you think about the classroom getting noisy and group work and all these things. You
Mm,
don't think about the background noise of the noise out in the hallway. Like I think that
mhm.
those are the things that are subtle, but they definitely build up as far as what your overall tolerance is,
Yeah.
and then depending on how well you slept the night before, or like you
Yes.
have an observation coming up with the principal, like who knows, like it just
Yeah.
magnifies.
And well, and I also have a real people pleasing tendency. And
Mhm.
so what would happen is that if I could sense, and there's the perceptiveness, if I could sense that one of my kids needed something, was
Mhm.
confused, had a question, whatever, I could not shut it out. And so it was just like
Yeah.
constantly trying to like feed baby birds all the time. And that energy was
Yeah.
exhausting.
Yes.
And I was not great at setting up systems where it was just like, we're not gonna
Yeah.
talk right now, and actually enforcing it. I would like, and maybe
Yeah.
that was my need for novelty. I would
Well,
see
that was,
something and be like,
I'm
oh
like,
yeah,
yeah, my impulsive brain, it was like, yeah, I'm always, it's such a catch-22.
yes.
It's
And
like,
we definitely never talk about this in teacher prep programs. Like
no.
the teacher's mind and the teacher's ego and none of that comes into play. And that's huge in terms of
Well,
how the classroom goes.
yeah, I don't want to go off on this tangent too much, but I will mention it. I don't think we talked about this in the last episode, but the idea of countertransference in education. Have you ever
It
heard about
sounds a
this?
little bit familiar.
So in mental health, one of the big things that we talk about at going into a therapeutic field is the idea of countertransference. It's a long story. I won't go into all of it, but basically it is the idea that as a therapist, I show up as myself in a session and I'm going to have emotions about what a client presents to me. So if my client presents to me in a way that reminds me of my sister and I have a bad relationship with my sister, am I aware of that enough so that I am not bringing that into the therapeutic relationship? I have to be able to be aware of those biases and put them aside. We do not talk about that in education. We do not
No.
talk about the emotional component of that and being able to identify what my needs are in order to be able to effectively let go of those things
Yeah.
in order to meet the needs of my students. And that's
Yep.
true for all educators, not just
Yep.
neurodivergent educators, but I think there's an extra layer on there for neurodivergent educators who, it's like, I remember times when there were things, and I am not proud of this, and I'll share this and just be really vulnerable about it. But there were things that happened to me as a student that I then replayed with my own students because I didn't have another way. I didn't know what to do instead.
Yeah.
But I knew it didn't work or feel good for me when it happened to me. And I look back on
Right.
those things and I'm like, why did I do that? And I can only go to the point where it's like, well, I just didn't know what else to do.
Yeah.
And so how do we make sure that people have really those those skills that are so important as far as how you show up for your students and
Yeah.
being able to recognize, like, what are the things that are influencing me as I am present here in this moment?
Is there like a specific example that's coming up in your mind when you say that you did
Mm.
things that
Yeah, I have a couple of them. There, oh gosh, it's really kind of embarrassing to talk about some
that's
of
why I
them.
want you to share it, because I know people are going to hear you and they'll be like, yep.
Okay, so please forgive me. And for this student, I hope this was my very first year teaching. But I was really struggling with work completion and getting things done, and just doing really poorly. And my teacher pulled me out in the hallway when I was in 5th grade and said, it was as it was on repeat, getting on my case. And she said to me,
Yeah.
do you want to fail 5th grade? You're going to fail 5th grade if you don't get your act together. You need to try harder. You need to do this. And I didn't do the exact same thing, but I did have a conversation with a student where those words, like, do you want to fail this? And I was like, I look back, I'm like, it was such I said it. And I think I even knew in the moment that I didn't want to do that. But that's that countertransference, right? I'm having emotions about this student who's reminding me of my past self. This is how it was handled in that moment. I don't have a better way to deal with it. And it really is. I don't think I've ever shared that with anybody. Now here it is on this podcast, but that's the one that stands out to me. And I look back and I'm like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I was 21 years old in a classroom of 26 third graders, and I did not have, honestly, a clue what I was doing.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's such a good example of how unprepared most teachers really are. And I pushed you to tell a story because I could tell it was going to be something a little bit embarrassing, but it's going to resonate with people. They're going to hear that and say, I think everyone has a story like that.
Yeah.
Maybe more than one.
Yeah. Well, and I do kind of joke. Some of my friends on social media are some of my students from that first year teaching. I do think everyone survived. But I
Mm-hmm.
look back and I'm like, oh, there's so many things I could have done better.
Gosh, yes, same. So, and the second year, and the third year, and the
Yes,
fifth
well,
year.
for sure. But
Yeah,
especially
for
that first year,
sure.
it was rough. It was rough for everyone, I think.
Hey, this is Jen. I am going to interrupt this episode for just a minute to tell you about something I think will be a big help to you as an educator, whether you're a teacher, a school leader, an instructional coach, or even someone studying to become a teacher. It's something I've been publishing for the last 10 years called The Teacher's Guide to Tech, and it's basically an encyclopedia of tech tools curated especially for teachers. My team and I keep an eye on all the tech tools that are out there, the ones that are fresh and new, and the ones that have stood the test of time, and we think about how they can best be used in classrooms. Then we sort them into categories, give you a really simple description of what each one does, provide a link to the tool's website so you can check it out, and we also pick out a video that shows the tool in action so you can understand quickly how it works and if it will work for you. And because tech changes all the time, we have to maintain these listings to make sure they stay fresh and accurate. On top of that, we have a really nice collection of articles we've written that will help you explore more ways to use tech and fine-tune and troubleshoot things as you go along. Plus, there's a huge glossary of tech terms to help you stay current with the language. In the past, this guide was published as a PDF that we updated once a year. Although this worked fine, that PDF would stay the same all year until the new edition came out. In January of 2025, we moved the entire guide to a fully online subscription-based model. This allows us to update it all year round, keeping it fresh and new all the time. A year's subscription costs exactly the same as the PDF used to cost, so we haven't raised the price one bit, and it's even more affordable if you get it as a group. To learn more about how this guide can help you become the most tech-savvy teacher in your school, visit teachersguidetotech.com. Let's take a look at and any other things about the system. So there's executive function overload, sensory stressors, and then you've got some other stuff, some social expectations and masking, which we've kind of gotten into.
Yeah,
a
we
little
talked.
bit already.
Yeah, I think we talked about the
Okay.
the masking and the camouflaging, whether it's staff dynamics or parent interactions, all of
Right.
those different things.
Okay.
The two that I will also just mention are kind of two that kind of go together in a lot of ways. One, I'll start with systems that don't fit.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. Some schools I know have teachers where you have to submit your lesson plans, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. When you talk about executive functioning, like overload, is there a system that is in place that could help support that? I'm not saying that the expectation doesn't exist, but what might make that work for some students? What is the mismatch of having that variability in attention and focus? The thing that sometimes comes out of that is if the systems don't really fit, sometimes it leads to something that I feel like has come up a couple of times where as educators, we become perfectionistic. We try to overcompensate for these things that we have internalized as things that are bad about us.
Yeah.
But then the next domino to fall is just this burnout. And we know that there's so many teachers who leave education. And I think a big reason for that is they're neurodivergent. They don't have the supports, they don't have the tools, and it's just too much. It's just too much to keep managing all of those expectations. And again, that was me. Like I said, I was not going back to teach, and ultimately I'm glad that I did because I do love it. But it was really hard, to have all of that. And so trying to find those pieces and recognize, like, what can we do to create systems for our teachers, just like we create systems for our students that allow the space for the sensory needs, right? Or when we're doing the master schedule, is there a way that we can, take into account on some level what that means for students, like teachers? I know that that's not always realistic, but maybe it's a conversation.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, just because we've always done things a certain way doesn't mean that that's set in stone.
Right.
So, we've talked a lot about sort of this whole idea of systemic change, and we're going to get to that in a minute. But just if a teacher's just working in a regular old school and they want to start attacking this problem right now,
Mhm.
what are some things that they can do to sort of manage this
Yeah.
better?
So, I always go to the executive functioning because I feel like that's one of the areas that is the most practical and can
Mm-hmm.
make the biggest impact. Um, so first of all, some of the very you have to just kind of figure out, like, as far as organization, like what works for you, and externalize those executive functioning components makes a big difference. So my sister, who also I don't she's not been diagnosed ADHD, but I mean, we can we can but she teaches kindergarten, and she has alarms
Mm.
on her phone and alerts on her calendar to remind her to take attendance every day,
Oh
because
my
it's like
gosh.
it's like, but she's
Yes.
externalizing that executive functioning. It's like, my brain is not going to remember that, so I
Yep.
need alerts, right? And so that might be so reminder apps, voice memos, trying
Mm-hmm.
to anything you can do to take the internal processes that you're doing mentally and make them outside of your brain,
Yeah.
because
Yep.
it does a couple of different things. First of all, it gives you a place and then a resource to go look for. But the other thing, when we're talking about anxiety and worry, one of the things that our brain does, which is really interesting, is when we are stressed or worried about something, we think about it, and it cycles, and we think about it and we think
Yes.
about it and we think about it, and our brain interprets that cycle of thinking about it as doing something, but we're not
Mm.
actually doing anything with it. And that's where that worry comes from. But if you can then simply do something with it, write it
Mm-hmm.
down, it actually
Mm-hmm.
stops that cycle, which then also improves the bandwidth that you have for everything else. It's like, okay, I did write that down. I know I'm going to come back to it. I don't need to
Yeah.
keep it in my head trying to remember
Right.
it.
Yeah, that's the exhaustion, is trying
Right.
to keep all of that stuff swirled in your head. Okay, so any and this is a whole lot of categories. It's like I've
Mhm.
got all the different, I've got Google Keep that I keep on my
Mhm.
phone. I have systems for writing things down now and making sure I check, and then there's a checklist
Yeah.
and the alarms. Yes, all of those things. Okay, so externalizing executive functioning.
Yep. Another one that kind of goes along with this. And so you're mentioning that you've got a lot of different systems. So sometimes for neurodivergent brains, too many systems sometimes many systems are too complicated. And
Yeah.
I say this a lot of times with students, like, if you have an ADHD kid and you come up with a new organizational system and it's color coded and it's great, like, that novelty is going to kick in. They're going to be super excited about it.
Yeah.
And it's going to last 2 weeks because
Yeah.
they can't keep up with it, because it
Yeah.
requires that executive functioning again. So then what is the simpler way to
Yeah.
organize those things? So for me, I have one planner. It has
Mhm.
some file pockets in the back, but
Mhm.
everything goes in the planner. That's the
Yes.
only place. I can't use an app on my phone and this and that. It's like
Yep.
I need everything in one place, because I will not remember to go and look at all of those different
Right.
places.
Mhm.
But you can also lean into that novelty if that's something that helps. Like, so the way that I do that for myself is I get very excited every year when I get to order a new planner, and I order one of those customizable planners that I get to, design it how I want. And so then that gives me that little dopamine kick that comes along with that
Mhm.
novelty piece.
Mhm.
But really the overall system is kind of staying the same. And
Yes.
so you can lean into that novelty where it works, but don't just like kind of upend the entire system, because
Right.
then you're just starting over and reinventing the wheel.
Yes. Yeah, if it's not working, you have to change something or
Hmm.
simplify something.
Hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
What else?
So another one would be batching tasks. So
Mhm.
I use this with students all the time. So if you have a student who is way behind on work, I always tell them, first of all, do the current stuff first.
Mm.
Keep up on the current stuff,
Yeah.
and then go back and do the old stuff in an order that makes, like, bundle them together. So I'm going to do all of my ELA stuff. I'm going to do all my social studies stuff. I'm going to do all of my
Mhm.
math stuff, and start and work through it, because it eliminates those transitions in between where, oh, now I have to do this. Now I have to do that. So, which just extends the process. So for teachers, like, okay, you're behind on grading, or you have to get your lesson plans turned in, or, I don't know, whatever it might be, responding to emails, like trying to batch and do all of those things, and knock out as much as you can in a certain amount of time
Yeah.
is going to be more efficient than losing that momentum of switching back and forth between tasks.
Mhm.
That cognitive load of task switching is really underestimated, both for everybody, really. It's like,
Yes.
and you don't even think about when you're quote unquote multitasking,
Mhm.
it's like the least efficient way to get things done.
Mhm. Okay. Good. All right. Batching and bundling
Yep.
tasks. Great.
Yep. Another one that I love is just body doubling. And so, and this is kind of a goofy term, but all it basically means is like an accountability partner, right? Who can
Mhm.
you be accountable with? And so, like, okay, we're going to work on grading these things. It's our plan time, but my teacher from across the hall is going to come in. We're both going to sit in the same classroom. We are not going to talk.
Yeah. That's the hardest
Yeah,
part. Yeah.
that is the hardest part.
Yeah.
But we're going to do this. And so, like, I know for me, like Amanda and I, when we were writing our book, it's like we would be sometimes on a Zoom together, but sometimes not even on a Zoom, but just like we would have our chat function up, like in, and so then
Yes.
we
And
would
you knew you
kind
were both in the kind of in the
in the
space.
space.
Yeah.
And like if I had a question, I could kind of ask it or whatever, but that was good to like, again, having that accountability. But body doubling is like having a co-working session or someone who is kind of working alongside you can be
Yeah.
super helpful to
It's like
just,
parallel play for
yeah,
like working adults. Yeah. Okay.
exactly. That's exactly what it is. Um,
Okay.
I would also just say, like, thinking about where can you manage sensory stuff? We've talked about it quite a bit, I feel like already,
Mhm.
but like, are there things that help you restore your sensory like capacity?
Mm. Yeah.
So like I'm going to sit with the lights off in my classroom for a little bit and
Mm.
kind of have that
Mhm.
quiet time. Do you need movement breaks? Do you need to get outside and walk around the building during your plan? Like what can you
Yeah.
do to try to reset if you have that sensory overwhelm? Um, that's another piece that can be helpful if you
Okay.
experience that.
Okay.
I think that, and then the last two that I'll kind of mention here specifically, I am a huge proponent of what's called energy mapping.
Yeah.
So, what this basically means is I know for me, I tend to be a morning person. And
Mhm.
so I am most alert in the morning. I am most focused in the morning. And so, actually, what works for me really well right now is the fact that because I primarily see clients in the afternoons and evenings, and because I tend to be I'm an ambivert, but kind of leaning extrovert on that side. So
Yeah.
having that one-on-one interaction with my clients in the afternoon and evening helps me stay engaged and focused. And
Yeah.
so then I use this morning time for the things that I really need to focus on, that I really need that real like attention and processing to be able to do.
Yes.
So that works for me. So what works for you? Like, are you somebody like, is it easier for you to grade papers at the end of the day? Is it easier for you
Mm.
to, again, if there's some flexibility with some of the scheduling, when is it best for you to meet with a parent, or
Right.
have those phone calls? Do you want to do it before school or after school? And trying
Mhm.
to kind of navigate that a little bit so that you are kind of being protective as
Yeah.
far as where that energy is going. And then the last one is just about self-compassion, which you kind of mentioned. Like
Mm.
one of my friends, Brandon Mahan, he does a lot of stuff in the ADHD space, and one of his phrases is sometimes the ADHD wins. Like
Yeah.
sometimes and it's like
Yeah.
that's okay.
Mhm.
Um, it doesn't mean you're a bad person. It doesn't
Yeah.
it doesn't mean that you're a bad teacher. Um, it doesn't mean that you're not professional. But
Right.
trying to not let that shame get a grip when things don't go the way you
Yeah.
want them to is really important.
Yeah, and it can help you just move on to the next day and not get bogged down in
Hmm.
just being mad at yourself. Yeah. Um, one other thing here really quickly is about leveraging novelty.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what is that?
Yeah. So thinking about this, so I kind of I think when we were talking about like the planner piece, right? Like I
Yeah.
like to kind of lean into that novelty. But so whenever I have a system in place with one of my clients specifically, sometimes you'll have a system in place, it'll work for a little bit, and
Mm.
then something won't work. So whether that's talking about just like self-regulation,
Mhm.
managing anxiety, like any particular thing, what I have often found is that if you find a system that works pretty well,
Mhm.
sometimes you can just tweak it a little bit to give it a kick of that novelty to reinvigorate that piece of it. So
Mm.
thinking about, how can you like, oh, I really like doing this particular type of lesson. And I want to try to do that again, but I'm kind of feeling bored of it. But how can I just like pull in a little bit of a piece to kind of do it a little bit differently this time?
Yeah.
It could be, thinking about like, I don't know whether it is. I mean, maybe you really love digging into a new app or a new program to kind of organize your things. Maybe you love building a new spreadsheet. And
But
so,
what heads up, yeah, but it's usually the first couple of hours of that. And then when it comes to actually
mhm.
completing it, then I mean, the number of unfinished projects I have out there. And so I think it's important when you're optimizing your ADHD to realize that if you think you need a whole new thing, stop for a second and see, is there
Yeah,
a way I can just tweak the thing I'm already doing? Because I
right.
might just burn out all of my synapses on this new
Yes.
project and realize I could have just
And
tweaked.
part of it is also like gamification. So thinking about how to
Oh,
so
yeah.
like there are actually a ton of apps out there that are like productivity apps that build
Yes.
in gamification. So that is the novelty piece. Some of them are
Mhm.
little role play games. Like there's one called
Mm.
Habitica, which is one of my favorites. I don't know if
Mm.
you've ever heard of it, but has
Mm-mm.
like this little character and you like set certain quests for yourself and you earn points and
I
like but
love it.
it's so it is an organizational system, but it has that novelty built in.
Yes.
And so, that's one way to kind of do that. Again, like you're saying, like, don't just throw everything out the window and start over. Try
Right.
to figure out what has worked in the past and how do I pull that back in to make it
Yes.
effective again, like in a little bit of a different way.
Okay. All right. And so those were all individual things that
Yeah.
teachers can just do for themselves. What are things that can be done more systemically? But if I'm a school leader and I know I've got some teachers that are struggling, what can I do systemically?
hmm So I think one of the biggest things is just talking about and normalizing
Mm.
neurodiversity. We
Mhm.
need to have open conversations about it. We need to really work on dismantling those stereotypes and the stigma.
Mhm.
Some people will feel comfortable talking about this. Some
Mhm.
people will have those labels and not feel comfortable talking about it. But I think what really needs to happen is having this opportunity um, for reflection and then setting the stage for teachers to be able to ask for accommodations when they need this. So I talk about this when we talk about students, we talk about self-advocacy. And but I that's kind of what we're getting at here, but I think it's really important to recognize that self-advocacy is really hard. It is
Yeah.
especially hard when you're in a situation where there's a power differential. And
Mm.
when you are asking for accommodations, that is scary. And so how do we make
Yeah.
sure that there is an opportunity to feel safe, to invite those conversations, to make sure that those are offered without a fear of judgment? And I think that is really the pressure is on the administration, the higher ups to set that stage because you can't just do it performatively. Can I say that?
Mm.
It can't just
Yep.
be performative. It has to be really, um, it has to be intentional and it
Yeah.
has to be thoughtful. And
Mhm.
in order to signal that psychological safety for people to approach that, because if you don't, then they're just going to kind of suffer in silence
Mhm.
and not have the supports that they need and then possibly there might be a really great teacher who walks out the door because they needed a little bit more.
Yeah. So school leaders, in addition to just opening up more conversations and sort of normalizing the idea that not only do we have neurodivergent kids, but on staff here, we've got plenty of people
Mhm.
who are, who have these differences in their brains, but then maybe also having more open conversations about, I mean, what kinds of accommodations? I
Right.
think a lot of teachers wouldn't even know that there are things that they could ask for. So making that transparent
Yeah.
too.
And sometimes it's not even knowing you don't have to know what to ask for necessarily. It's just the opportunity to have the conversation.
Yeah.
I'm struggling with this. I think it's related to this. I'm not sure
Yeah.
what might be an option, but maybe we
Right.
could think about something that might work.
Hmm.
And sometimes and then just having the check-in, right? So maybe you try something for a little bit and see if it might help or whatever. And sometimes it just requires some creativity. But
Yeah.
I really believe that that is something that can be really powerful. And sometimes if you're an administrator and you have somebody who's on your faculty who comes to you and says something like, maybe there really is nothing that you can do. Like maybe
Mm.
again, if it's like
Mm-hmm.
you might not have a whole lot of options, then you kind of fall into this role of, I'm still here to support you.
Yeah.
I hear you. I understand. Like, you can try to find other ways perhaps to make sure that that teacher feels supported. But I also kind of, even as I'm talking about this, I'm like going, I feel like there's always something, even if it's
Mm.
small, that maybe
Mm-hmm.
could be attempted to try
Yeah.
to mitigate whatever that area of difficulty is.
I'm also thinking, what a really interesting opportunity for the special educators in the building to
Yes. What a great
collaborate
point.
with their
Yeah.
peers.
Mhm.
They've got all this knowledge about strategies and accommodations that have all been used on the kids. And it's just like, hold on, that maybe you can help us come up with some ideas too.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it is it, actually, schools probably are one of the best equipped places to
Right.
support the staff who is neurodivergent,
Exactly.
because we have people there who literally do that all the time for kids.
Yeah.
And so it's not all that different.
Right. Right. Okay. So what are some other systemic
Yeah.
things that can happen?
So just really being intentional about communication in general. So
Mm-hmm.
ambiguity is
Mm.
not good for anybody when you are trying to
Yeah.
communicate. Be really clear. We talk about with students, give explicit instruction. Same for teachers. Don't
Mm-hmm.
use indirect communication that can be confused. So, especially for autistic individuals, like trying to read between the lines gets really tricky. And
Yeah.
so, and you can misinterpret things or not understand. And then if you're afraid to ask questions, then that causes things. But be really, like, if there's a deadline, be really clear about that. If there are certain priorities that you need people to focus on, make sure that they know what those priorities are.
Mm-hmm.
Offer that really stable, consistent communication, and make sure, I think this is one of the areas, again, that sometimes gets missed, but however you're communicating, do it consistently in the same way, but sometimes you might need to offer it in different ways. So for some people, like for example, do you know Loom?
Mm.
Do you know the website Loom? Have you ever seen this one? It's
Mm-hmm.
you don't have to use Loom to
Mm-hmm.
do this, but this is what I'm going to use as a point of reference. But basically, it's just a screen recording program where it also then records a video of yourself talking through something if you want, but then it'll actually create an AI description and outline of it. But what you could do
Yeah.
is provide, like, talk through something that you're sharing out with the staff, but then also put the written
Yeah.
description. So people could either watch the video, or they could read the steps, or they could look at both, but giving it in
Right.
multiple
Right.
modalities can be really helpful. Some people prefer it one way, some people prefer it another. But the nice thing about it is there are tools right now that don't require extra time to feel like you're doing both.
Right. Right. Okay. Fantastic. So normalize neurodiversity, provide clear communication, maybe even differentiate your delivery
Mm-hmm.
system so that people can access them in different ways. What are a couple of other things
Yeah.
administrators can do?
Just reflect on what those bureaucratic types of tasks are. Like, what are
Mm.
the things? Are there areas that are overloaded? Are there things that can be streamlined? Are there things that can be, put in systemically across the board so that it's the same whether you're dealing with, the counseling department or I don't know, whatever it might be, like all of the different places. But
Yeah.
how can things be, just even sharing documents, right? Like, uh,
Mm-hmm.
is it always going to be on the Google Drive? Is it always going to be
Right.
on the shared folder on the wherever it is? But
Mm-hmm.
and that could also be even like possibly in a smaller ecosystem. So like within a department, right? If you're a
Yeah.
department leader, like, but just making sure that it is consistent, because there's nothing harder than like going, okay, where was that document supposed to be again? Maybe it's here, maybe it's there, or how do I submit this? Trying to make sure that it is consistent, and also, if possible, that there is a step-by-step outline that people can refer back to if they're not sure, so they don't have to necessarily go and ask for help, but there's a
Mm.
resource that's available for that.
Yes, to help people find their way back to it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep. I think another one is just being flexible. in general. And it kind of goes back to that, having that communication and being a little able to brainstorm through it, but just recognize that, like, just because it's the way that things have always been done doesn't mean that it always has to be done that way forever and ever.
Mm,
And so, what does it look like for professional development? Like, are there asynchronous options? I mean, that's a tough one, but maybe in some situations that might be something that would be beneficial.
yeah.
As somebody who does a lot of PD with districts, I'll be really honest. Like, I would always prefer to have everybody in the same space. But then
Mm,
if everybody is in the same space, okay, so what are the sensory components there? Like, if you need to get up and stand at the back of the room, like giving that explicit permission for those types of things can
yeah.
be helpful. Plan time, like what makes that effective for certain people, and is there any flexibility with that? But just being open to having those conversations and trying to find flexible solutions can be really helpful.
Mm,
Kind of along with that, the other thing I would say about the flexibility is, like, when we are talking about accommodations,
mm,
really trying to make sure that there is a pathway for having those conversations, that teachers know how. Like, again, I talked about kind of opening that door for self-advocacy, but, like,
mm-hmm.
how can we know that if they need something, they can communicate that confidentially, so that they can try to figure out, what might work without necessarily feeling like that's going to be disclosed more widely. Especially when
Yeah.
we start talking about disclosing diagnoses, um, that gets really tricky. I always tell people, it's like, talk to HR. They're going to know the ins and outs of what works with
Mm,
your
mm-hmm.
district for
Mm-hmm.
that, because it just is so, there's a fine line with some of those things, but at the same time, we want to create an environment where people feel comfortable talking about that.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Another thing that I always think about too is just about community and
Mm,
having the opportunity to talk to other people. One thing that I don't see a lot of districts doing, but I know a lot of businesses that I work with do, is they have ERGs. Are you familiar with ERGs, what that acronym stands for?
mm-mm, I
It's
don't think so.
employee resource groups. So in business,
Okay.
lots of organizations have ERGs. So you might have a parenting ERG, or you might have a mental health ERG, or a neurodiversity ERG, or it could be like a
They sound
lot.
like affinity groups, kind
Yeah,
of.
yeah, 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 yeah. I would
Yeah.
say that that's,
Okay.
yeah. And
Okay.
so, but basically, like, how great would it be to have that opportunity in the
Mm,
schools for educators? Like, oh well, we're going to have this opportunity. It's not necessarily anything more formal. Sometimes it's like, just getting together over lunch or via Zoom or whatever, but just having the opportunity to connect, to talk to people, to know that you're not alone. Who are the people that you can
yeah.
go to? But any other ways that you can try to connect people who maybe feel separate, who feel different. How do we connect them with the people who help them feel like they're not alone? And
Mm,
giving that relationship, that community, to help
yeah.
them feel like they have people.
That's great. That's a great idea.
And yeah, and so I think, and the last thing I would just mention as far as strategies would just be, um, just modeling compassion.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think that you really have to understand, when you are approaching something, ableism is really baked into our society. It
Yeah.
is something that is internalized for many of us. And so, how do we make sure that we are approaching these things with an open mind with our staff? How do we make sure that we are um, using compassion, and trying to, value transparency and being flexible? All of those things really go a huge way, just as far as, like, the overall culture in a school
Mm,
building, again, that makes
mm-hmm.
teachers want to stay, and we don't
Yeah.
want to lose good teachers.
Mm-mm. Mm-mm. Before I ask you the last question, let people know where are the best places to find your work
Yeah,
online.
yeah. So, if anyone's interested in our book, Amanda Morin and I co-wrote, "Neurodiversity Affirming Schools: Transforming Practices So All Students Feel Accepted and Supported." That's available on Amazon or through our publisher, Free Spirit Publishing. You can find our podcast, the Neurodiversity Podcast, anywhere you listen to podcasts. And then, all the social media places. Just look up the Neurodiversity Podcast or my name, Emily Kircher Morris, and Facebook, Instagram. Um, LinkedIn. Those are the primary places where I kind of spend time.
Okay, so before we wrap up, just do you have any sort of final words that you want to share on this topic with teachers?
Yeah, I think the whole premise of the neurodiversity movement is about depathologizing and destigmatizing all of these different labels and recognizing that people who show up in different ways have things to offer to our communities. And we want that variability. We want those differences and those variations. And so remembering that even though somebody might be struggling with something, it's not about fixing that person or fixing that problem. It's about fixing the system and trying to create a system that allows all types of brains to thrive. And so whether that's for our students or for our teachers or in our families or wherever that might be, really working on figuring out like where can we make the tweaks in our system that allow everybody to thrive is just going to make a huge difference.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you for having me.
To read Emily's post and a full transcript of our conversation, visit cultofpedagogy.com, click podcast, and choose episode 264. To get a regular email from me about my newest blog posts, podcast episodes, courses, products, and speaking services, sign up for my mailing list at cultofpedagogy.com/subscribe. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great day.